open our report. Yes, I'm so happy to see here all of our participants today, regular and new. And I am happy that you visited our permanent international philosophical seminar Postscriptum. With today's meeting, we begin our cycle of dialogues and discussion in the 1924-1925 academic year. As you know, this is a very difficult period for our country and for our universities. And at the same time, I will start to invite our participants and continue to my speech. Maybe I will have some trouble. Difficult and intense time for our country and universities. And however, I would like to continue a postscriptum, good traditions. And I'm very grateful to my colleagues and partner from Kryvyi State Pedagogical University. First of all, Nadia Kazachenko and Olena Mishalova. They created a web page and YouTube channel of our seminar. The link is the invitation letter. And I am so happy to welcome our speaker today, Professor Pavel Gavrilyuk, a famous Orthodox theologian and philosopher, founder and president of the non-profit organization Rebuild Ukraine, founder and president of the International Orthodox Theological Association, IOTA. Pavel Gavrilyuk and I are united by a deep interest in the creative heritage of outstanding intellectuals of the first wave of the emigration from the territory of Ukraine, Dmitry Chyzhevsky and George Florovsky. Both of these intellectuals celebrate memorable date this year. 130 years since the birth of Dmitry Chyzhevsky. Just I will invite in our Dmitry Chyzhevsky, and 45 years from the death of the George Florovsky. And I have just returned from the Kropivnitsky, formerly Yelisavetgrad. This is the birthplace regions of Florovsky and Chyzhevsky. A large conference dedicated to the Chyzhevsky anniversary was held in Kropivnitsky. At this conference, a joint attempt was made to look at the life and legacy of Chyzhevsky through the eyes of the contemporary citizen of Ukraine, who lives in a situation of the terrible war with Russia. Today's conversation is not an anniversary speech or praise, not a hagiography or encomium. As Pavel Gavrilyuk rightly noted on the eve of our seminar, let me quote your post in Facebook. I don't approach Florovsky devotionally. Rather, I prefer to think with him about some contemporary issues, including the ongoing horrible war. So, the floor is given to Professor Pavel Gavrilyuk. Let's start.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Golubovich, Inna, and colleagues. It's just wonderful to see each other. I applaud your efforts. I applaud your efforts to continue this seminar in difficult times. I think this is also an exercise for all of us in spiritual resistance and resilience. For me, not a single working day passes without thinking about the situation on the front lines. And Rebuild Ukraine that you mentioned has been honored and fortunate to supply medical supplies to Ukraine's defenders. There was a time when I completely set aside my scholarship and I was just thinking of one thing, and that's the tourniquets. And presently, it seems that tourniquets and some other medical supplies are in relatively good numbers at the front. At least that's what our intelligence tells us. But we've sort of changed our focus to tactical medicine, and that is basically teaching people how to survive the bombings and the wounding, specifically, resulting in being wounded in battle, the bleeding that results from that. And we're also in the rehabilitation of children. So that's the kind of work that we're continuing to do. And my today's presentation is dedicated to a soldier that we recently lost. He was in very dangerous reconnaissance missions, and his name was Denis or Dennis. And he's a close friend of our manager of operations in Ternopil. So the title of today's presentation, colleagues, is Intellectual History as a Vehicle of Emancipation. And then the subtitle is the comparison of Dmytro Chyzhevsky's Outlines of the History of Philosophy in Ukraine and Florovsky's Ways of Russian Theology. Is it appropriate for historical analysis to become an act of emancipation? Could the writing of history become an emancipatory act and still remain history? Or does such a use of history turn historical analysis into something else? These are general methodological questions that I'd like us to keep in mind as we proceed. There's a narrow sense in which historical work, whether archival research or oral history or process of historical analysis itself, are intrinsically emancipatory. Any worthwhile historical analysis, if it is not a regurgitation of what has been previously known, involves a turning of the forgotten and misunderstood past into the past that's remembered and better understood. To the extent to which the plowing of historical evidence involves a retrieval of new facts or a better understanding of well-known facts in light of evidence or a better interpretative framework, the outcome of the historian's work could be a vehicle of emancipation. It is emancipation in the broadest possible sense from error and oblivion. Now, let me be clear, however, that not all emancipation from oblivion qualifies as history writing. And so when Julian Assange uploaded a huge cache of secret government documents on the internet, he was not writing history, although his shocking act received much public attention and in this sense made history. It is clear, however, that simply releasing new and sensational information doesn't qualify as a historical analysis, and one may also doubt if such an act should be characterized as rebellious, criminal, or emancipatory. Now, well-informed people may reasonably disagree over their evaluation of Assange's actions. My main point is that even those actions broadly qualify, even if they broadly qualify as intending emancipation, the data released was just that, raw data, not history. But what about the acts of emancipation that claim to be historical? For example, Adolf von Harnack wrote his famous History of Dogma, Dogmengeschichte, in order to liberate the gospel from the corrupting influence of Greek philosophy, and broadly speaking, in order to de-Hellenize Christianity. Harnack himself, with his own work on Marcion, as well as the German historians of the Third Reich, labored to de-Judaize Christianity historically and theologically. Learning from the tragic lessons of the Holocaust, biblical scholars and Christian historians writing after World War II, in contrast, became intentional about recovering the Jewishness of Jesus. The trend towards a better understanding of Jesus through the matrix of the first century Judaism had not lost its relevance today. Now, a more obvious narrative of emancipation is that of feminist history. Broadly speaking, feminist history is a rereading of history from women's perspective. More directly, however, feminist history is precisely an act of emancipation, summarized in the following dictum. Women have been absent from history. That absence matters. Therefore, women must be restored to history. I should say that my own research, particularly on Schmemann and Florovsky letters, it became very clear to me how a lot of prominent women on whom I wanted to write short bibliographic notes, it was simply very difficult to retrieve their lives precisely because of the situation. So there's clearly ample factual evidence for this claim. So feminist history emerged in the 1960s as an arm of the women's liberation movement. From the very beginning, feminist history has been an emancipatory act. In other words, for feminist historians, their work had a specific moral and political impetus from the start, namely the rectification of the fundamental injustice of rendering women invisible in history, or, what is perhaps worse, making the historical presentation of women the sole prerogative of men. Now, another narrative of emancipation that's closer to what we're discussing here is post-colonial history. This form of history could be defined as a history of nations or other political entities that were formerly colonized by other nations or empires. For example, the post-colonial history of Morocco in the first half of the 20th century is going to be a narrative of emancipation from Spanish and French colonization, with everything that this entails. The same applies to the history of all countries with a colonial past. Post-colonial history is also emancipation in the sense of offering an alternative to the imperial narrative of the past. And that's one of the elements that I will be touching on today. The imperial narrative is produced by the political and military victors. In this narrative, the colonial powers are typically represented as morally and intellectually superior to the colonized. The imperial narrative typically deprives the colonized people of their own voice and recasts their experiences and achievements through the eyes of the colonizers and the historians whose work is funded by the colonizers. In the worst-case scenario, the colonized people are dehumanized, and the imperial historians uncritically accept the rhetoric of dehumanization. So with these methodological considerations in the background, we come to two narratives of Ukrainian intellectual history. The first narrative is that of Dmytro Chyzhevsky. As Inna has already mentioned, the dates are 1894 to 1977, and that's Narys's Истории философии на Україні, or the outlines of the history of philosophy in Ukraine, to which I will be simply referring as the outlines, published in Prague in 1931. The second narrative is that of George Florovsky, 1893 to 1979, and that is Пути русского богословия, and that is, of course, the ways of Russian theology, published by YMCA Press in Paris in 1937. Chyzhevsky and Florovsky were contemporaries. Both were born in the 1890s and both died in the 1970s, with only 2 years apart from each other. Florovsky spent his childhood and college years in Odessa, where, of course, Inna is located, and perhaps some others. He studied natural sciences and history of philosophy at Novorossiysk University in the early 1910s. Chyzhevsky was born in Alexandria, but went on to pursue his university studies in mathematics and astronomy at the University of St. Petersburg in 1911-1913, and then transferred to St. Volodymyr's University in Kyiv to major in history and philology, and then graduating in 1919. Florovsky had a Ukrainian mother and a Russian father, both of whom came from clergy families. Chyzhevsky had a Russian mother and a Ukrainian Polish father. After the Bolshevik Revolution, both ended up abroad. Florovsky's family fled Soviet Ukraine and first settled in Sofia, Bulgaria. Chyzhevsky left Kyiv in 1921 to continue his philosophical studies in Heidelberg, Germany. Both then moved to Prague, Florovsky in 1922 and Chyzhevsky in 1924. Florovsky left Prague for Paris in summer of 1926. Chyzhevsky stayed until 1932, during which period he taught first at Dragomanov Pedagogical Ukrainian Institute in Prague and later at Free Ukrainian University, producing different editions of his work on the history of philosophy in Ukraine. According to Taras Zakydalski, I don't know if Taras is joining us, perhaps not. According to Taras Zakydalski, the work appeared first as Філософія на Україні спроба історіографії, and that's in 1926, with second edition in 28, and then in a fuller and more popular version as Narys's Історії філософії на Україні, and that is the edition that I'm discussing here of 1931. Now, the latter was a reconstruction from memory and remaining materials of a lost larger manuscript completed in 1927. In 1932, Chyzhevsky moved back to the University of Halle in Germany, where he stayed during World War II, completing his dissertation on Hegel in Ruslan, or Russia. After the war, Florovsky, toggling now back to Florovsky, moved to the United States in 1948, where he remained until his death. Florovsky first headed St. Vladimir Seminary and Academy, and then moved to Harvard Divinity School in 1956. Chyzhevsky also briefly moved to the United States in 1951, where he became professor of Slavic studies at also Harvard University until, incidentally, the year that Florovsky joined the faculty in 1956, when he returned to Germany to lead the Institute of the Slavic Studies at the Heidelberg University. So the story of their interactions and friendship has been ably researched by Inna Golubovich, Irina Valyavko, and a number of others. Florovsky and Chyzhevsky maintained scholarly exchange for over 4 decades, periodically consulting each other on various topics of mutual interest. Florovsky studied Chyzhevsky's work closely and relied on the outlines of the history of philosophy in Ukraine for his discussion of Ukrainian philosophers and theologians in the ways of Russian theology, but chose a historiographic framework that was quite different from that of Chyzhevsky. According to Vilyan Horsky, Chyzhevsky, and I quote, can justifiably be considered to be the founder of the scholarly discipline of the history of Ukrainian philosophy, unquote. I would be curious to know what others in this colloquium think of this historical judgment. It does ring true to me. Chyzhevsky begins the outlines by distinguishing 2 approaches to philosophy, rationalistic and romantic. The rationalistic approach understands philosophy to be dealing with universal truths that do not depend upon cultural or historical context. In reality, however, all philosophical truths are historically conditioned to some extent. And so the rationalists accept this reality, but treat historical conditioning as a limitation or aberration. The romantic approach, which Chyzhevsky associates with Hegel, understands the historical, cultural, and national expressions of philosophy as partial expressions of the universal truth that should not be easily discounted. And he approvingly mentions a claim that is generally attributed to Hegel, although that's not a direct quote, that, quote, the history of philosophy is a history of the mistakes of the human spirit. Again, not a direct quotation, but sometimes misquoted and misattributed to Hegel directly. Chyzhevsky favors the romantic approach as it makes cultural space for philosophy in Ukraine. He is appropriately modest and admits that, and I quote, the Slavic and particularly Ukrainian philosophy must still await its quote-unquote great philosopher. So Chyzhevsky recognized that his outlines remain tentative and sketchy. He distinguishes the following common psychological traits of Ukrainians that are relevant for the understanding of Ukrainian philosophy. And I quote, emotionalism and sentimentalism, sensitivity and lyricism. I think this was tremendously affected by the fact that he also studied extensively Ukrainian Baroque and also Ukrainian Romantic literature. And so that it's colored, that particular generalization is colored by that. He also emphasizes, I quote, individualism and love of freedom, unquote. Chyzhevsky was especially interested in what he called, following Pamphil Yurkevich, philosophy of the heart. And I would love to get a discussion going specifically on that question. I actually do take his thesis about the philosophy of the heart that characterizes for Ukrainian thinkers quite seriously. And I think that there could be some really wonderful work done in this area. He traces the philosophy of the heart to the works of Grigory Skovoroda, Mykola Gogol, Pamphil Yurkevich, and Panteleimon Kulish. As we can see from this list, Chyzhevsky's understanding of philosophy was very broad. His list of the philosophers of the heart includes a fiction writer and theologian Gogol, as well as poet Kulish. Chyzhevsky incorporated all notable Ukrainian theologians into his history of philosophy without making a rigid distinction between translators of patristic texts, constructive theologians, and philosophers. I would say that given the nature of the evidence, given the nature of the sources, I think that that approach is justified. And the approach to limit the history of philosophy in Ukraine to exclusively those who can be, in a very technical sense, considered academic philosophers, I think that's too narrowing of a lens. For my purposes, it's much more important whether you agree or disagree with his with his claim. For my purposes, what's actually important is that the comparison between Florovsky's ways of Russian theology and what Chyzhevsky is doing on the philosophical side makes perfect sense, because they're really talking about the same sets of evidence in many ways, okay? Or at least, again, the same sets of evidence. I want to emphasize the word sets. So the philosophy of the heart is featured in the work of the 4 authors in different ways. Skovoroda creatively develops the biblical anthropology of the inner and outer person. The inner person is the true self, whereas the outer person, which Skovoroda associates with the fleshy and the bodily self. The 2 parts of the self are united in one person without division or separation. These terms are borrowed from the Chalcedonian definition, where they characterize the relationship between Christ's divine and human natures. Now, the abyss that calls upon the abyss, and this is Psalm 41:8, in human person is precisely the heart. Skovoroda doesn't reduce the heart to the center of emotions exclusively. The heart is the source of human thoughts and desires. According to Chyzhevsky, Skovoroda overcame the one-sided rationalism of his time by insisting that, and I quote, the deep heart or thought is the real human being and head, whereas the external surface is nothing other than shadow, heel, or tail. Now, my English translation loses much of the vividness and music of Skovoroda's Ukrainian. For this reason, it should be cited in the original. And this is what Skovoroda says. Глибоке серце або думка, вона то є самою дійсною людиною та головою, а зовнішня його поверхня є ніщо інше, як тінь, п'ята і хвіст. End of quotation. The heart is also the site of the struggle between good and evil in human person. The purity of heart is secured at the expense of the spiritual battle with the lower inclinations of the self. Intriguingly, Chyzhevsky finds in Skovoroda a teaching concerning deification based on his philosophy of the heart. The primary emphasis is on the self-emptying of one's will in order to be filled with God. This is where I'm somewhat skeptical, although again, it would be interesting to put a capable student to research this particular hypothesis that there is an account of deification in Skovoroda. For Gogol, the fundamental difference is between the heart that is alive and the heart that is dead. This is, of course, the central motif of his novella, Mертвые души, or Dead Souls. What is at stake is being alive to God and to the suffering of one's neighbor. The root problem is the hardness of heart or heartlessness, бессердечность. It's easier to cure a person from physical illness than from the illness that affects the heart when it becomes hardened. Humans need to work on softening their hearts and on becoming spiritually alive, according to Gogol. With Yurkevich, we come to a philosopher who left a more focused treatment of the heart in his philosophical essay, The Heart and Its Significance in the Spiritual Life of Human Person, according to the teaching of scriptures. Yurkevich, with Skovoroda and Gogol, has a conviction that the heart identifies a depth of the human spirit. With Skovoroda, he rejected the claim that the will and emotions are mere functions of thinking. Yurkevich conceived his psychology in anti-rationalistic terms as a psychology of the heart. The heart is the source of philosophical ideas. The function of the mind is to develop the ideas that are born in the heart. We appropriate the truth only when our heart finds those truths congenial. Significantly, more could be said about Yurkevich's philosophical and biblical theology of the heart. In fact, again, Inna mentioned Iota. So Iota Publications plans to bring out Yurkevich's work in an English translation with a suitable introduction. And I hope that in this introduction, Chyzhevsky's pioneering narrative of philosophy in Ukraine would be given its due attention. Chyzhevsky's narrative begins with the adoption of Christianity in the ancient Ukraine and moves pretty quickly to the 16th century. Same pace, by the way, in Florovsky. He discusses the work of the translators of the Greek patristic writings and ancient Greek philosophers, the Judaizers, the Ostrog school of 1580 and 1508. He then shifts to the discussion of the curriculum, the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which traces its origins to 1615. He briefly dwells on Petro Mohyla and Stefan Yavorsky, and then Teofan Prokopovich, and mentions less significant figures too. The bulk of the outlines is taken up with the 19th century. Also, when you look, of course, at Florovsky's Ways of Russian Theology, you can also see that time expands as you move closer to the present. And so the 19th century takes up more than a half of the volume. The most significant achievement of Chyzhevsky's work was to bring the scattered achievements of Ukrainian philosophers under one cover into one narrative. Now, this act in and of itself amounts to a synthesis and emancipation from oblivion. The philosophical and cultural voice of Ukraine was muffled by the Russian Empire politically, economically, and ideologically. Politically, Ukrainian language was repressed. Economically, the best Ukrainian intellectuals were attracted by the educational potential and financial incentives of the major centers in Moscow and Petersburg. Ideologically, the historians of the Russian Empire absorbed the contributions of the Ukrainian thinkers, and that's theologians, philosophers, writers, and poets, into the imperial narrative of Russian history, to which I now come. So in contrast, Florovsky's ways of Russian theology assumes the main contours of the Russian imperial narrative. Florovsky doesn't argue for the legitimacy of this narrative framework, but takes it for granted. In order to understand why Florovsky would make such an assumption, we need to say a few words about his background and intellectual evolution. The ancestors of Florovsky's father's side were Russian, and on his mother's side, Ukrainian. His mother, Claudia Georgievna Popruzenko, came from a Ukrainian family of high-level academic clergy. Claudia's father, Georgy Popruzenko, finished Kiev Theological Academy and in 1850s settled in Odessa, where he taught Hebrew and Greek at the local theological seminary. At some point, possibly after the move to Odessa, on his mother's side, the family was Russified. Half Ukrainian himself, George Florovsky was able to read Ukrainian, but spoke primarily Russian at home and identified with the Russian imperial rather than with the national Ukrainian cultural heritage. Similar to his many contemporaries, he accepted the Russian imperial claim to the Ukrainian lands as a historical reality that raised no questions and required no justification. As a result, in his historiographic scheme, Ukrainian intellectual history was simply absorbed into the intellectual history of the Russian Empire, and the history of the Ukrainian theology was absorbed into the ways of Russian theology. So we're dealing really primarily with an absorption narrative, but within that narrative, there is an interesting emancipatory twist. In 1920s, Florovsky had to interrupt his graduate studies at the University of Odessa to follow his parents to Sofia in Bulgaria, while Ukraine was plunged into the civil war, which broke out after the Bolshevik Revolution. In Sofia, Florovsky became one of the founding fathers of the Eurasian movement. The Eurasian ideology postulated a unity between the peoples of Asia and Eastern Europe, which was based on common historical, geographic, and religious factors. The Eurasians continued the Slavophile critique of the Western European civilization in the changed circumstances of post-revolutionary diaspora. While the Eurasian geopolitical theory was scientifically dubious at best, the Eurasian movement had considerable success in immigration. By the mid-1920s, Florovsky became alienated from the movement since he did not share its political aspirations. Specifically, Florovsky rejected the claim that after the fall of Bolshevism, the teaching of the Orthodox Church was to replace Marxism as an ideological foundation of an authoritarian state. Does that sound familiar? Florovsky was dismayed at such an instrumentalization of religion, at the subordination of Christian faith to politics. At about the same time, the movement also was infiltrated by the agents of Stalin's secret police and undermined internally. Now, decades later, in the Soviet Union, the Eurasian doctrine found a new life in the theories of Lev Gumilyov. In the post-Soviet Russia, the Eurasian ideology received new life in the works of Igor Shafarevich and Alexander Dugin, whose geopolitical theories inform much of Putin's thinking. This thinking became progressively aggressive and militant, leading to the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of Western Ukraine in 2014, and to the presently continuing full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Putin justifies his libido dominandi by recourse to the Russian world doctrine, which is disseminated and developed by the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill Gundyaev, who has the institutions of the church and the propaganda machine of the Russian state media at his disposal. The Russian world doctrine is a contemporary version of Eurasianism. It's a perversion of the Orthodox faith ideologically that is also weaponized to justify Russia's imperial expansion. Florovsky's heritage stands in an ambiguous relationship to the Eurasian project. Okay, so I want to emphasize here the word ambiguous is intentional. On the one hand, as a staunch critic of Eurasianism, he would have been dismayed at the misuse of the Orthodox faith to justify a war. On the other hand, his political imagination did not include a possibility of a free and sovereign Ukrainian state. So in the interwar period, as the hopes of the fall of the communist regime in the Soviet Union faded in the diaspora, Florovsky became less concerned about rescuing the Soviet Russia and Ukraine from the Bolsheviks and more preoccupied with liberating 20th century Orthodox theology from its Western captivity. So my view here is that it's important that both in the case of Chyzhevsky and Florovsky, we're dealing with emigre or diaspora accounts, historical accounts, and I can return to that point later. This concern provided a major impetus for writing The Way of Russian Theology. Hence, in Florovsky's work, we are dealing with a narrative of emancipation that, of course, is also radically different from that of Chyzhevsky. Florovsky discusses the historical development of. Florovsky takes, as I said, the political narrative of Russian imperial history for granted. This narrative connected the historical path of Kiev and Rus with that of the Muscovite kingdom. Under the influence of this narrative, Florovsky projected the later reality of Russia's political dominance over Ukraine onto the earlier period of Ukrainian history. Importantly, he seldom uses the term Ukrainian when describing the Kievan theological tradition and prefers to call it West Russian or simply Russian instead. And I should add that such a naming convention, or rather misnaming convention, is a common problem in the 20th century Russian and Western scholarship. Such renaming of Ukrainian realities into Russian imperial realities simply rendered Ukraine and its history invisible, at best. I must confess that before the war, I was less attuned to this problem than I am now. So the war has really changed my own hermeneutical lens in many ways. In the first chapter, Florovsky discusses how in the 10th century Kievan Rus made a momentous decision to embrace Eastern Orthodox Christianity, determining its Byzantine orientation. While Rus was able to appropriate Byzantine piety, asceticism, and iconography, the Church failed to draw creatively upon Byzantium's theological riches. Florovsky takes Byzantine influence as normative and organic and construes the turning of Slavic Orthodoxy towards the West in the 16th century as a betrayal of the Greek patristic tradition, as a pseudomorphosis. Against this background, Florovsky sees the Union of Brest of 1596 as a result of which a part of the Ukrainian Church established communion with Rome as an anomaly and a schism within what he calls the West Russian Church. Florovsky correctly associates the rise of the Orthodox theological schools with the emergence of the brotherhoods in Lviv, Vilna, Kyiv, and other cities. He admits that only Western Protestant and Catholic schools could supply these brotherhoods with viable educational paradigms. At the same time, Florovsky insists that such paradigms led to the loss of the distinctively Byzantine Orthodox identity. Florovsky's assessment of the impact of the Kievan metropolitan Petro Mohyla, the founder of the first theological school in Eastern Europe, is quite damning. And so here I'm going to give a fairly large quotation. I quote, "Under Mohyla, the Western Russian Church comes out of its disarray and disorganization from which it suffered from the time of the Union of Brest. Yet everything is suffused with a foreign Latin spirit. This was an acute Romanization of Orthodoxy, a Latin pseudomorphosis of Orthodoxy. A Latin and Latinizing school system is built on an empty spot. Not only ritual and language, but also theology, worldview, and religious psychology become Latinized. The very soul of the people comes to be Latinized." End of quotation. Very passionate stuff. In his analysis, Florovsky largely ignored the fact that during the time of Metropolitan Mohyla, central Ukraine was politically dominated by Poland, not by Russia or Byzantium. Florovsky assumed that nothing good whatsoever could come to the Kievan school from adopting the Jesuit educational paradigms. Florovsky integrated the Slavophile disparagement of the Western influences of Slavic culture with the Westernizers' tendency to berate Slavic ability to appropriate Western ideas in a genuinely creative manner. For him, Ukrainian Baroque was, and I quote, "a decadent and uncreative period, which is responsible for," I quote, "emotional insobriety, dreamy excitability, and religious romanticism in Ukrainian religious consciousness." So I think what he's doing, he's taking Chyzhevsky's thesis and kind of turning it on its head and essentially creating vice out of what Chyzhevsky construed neutrally or certainly construed as something typical. Even the most outstanding representatives of Ukrainian Baroque, Grigory Skovoroda, didn't pass Florovsky's test of theological originality. Florovsky criticized Skovoroda for his inclination towards allegorical rather than a historical reading of scripture. Now, we might recall that Chyzhevsky's assessment of Ukrainian Baroque in general and Skovoroda in particular was significantly more positive. While recognizing considerable advantages to implementing the Western European educational standards in Kiev theological institutions, Florovsky nevertheless concluded that the end result of this development was orthodoxy's Western captivity and pseudomorphosis of Orthodox theological thought. From Kiev, Western patterns of thought spread to Moscow and Petersburg. While a few individual thinkers were able to break out of this dominant paradigm, Russian religious thought remained captive to Western influences until the beginning of the 20th century. According to Florovsky, only a return to the Church Fathers could liberate Orthodox theology from its Western captivity. Florovsky's historiographic scheme presupposes a seamless movement of the centers of theological scholarship from Kiev to Moscow and subsequently to Petersburg. Such a scheme uncritically follows the imperial narrative of Russian political history prevalent in the official Russian historiography since Nikolai Karamzin, 1766-1826. The scheme either ignored the ethnic distinctiveness of the Eastern Slavs, especially the Ukrainians, or construed the Muscovite kingdom as politically as ethnically continuous with the Kievan Rus. Consequently, Polish and Austro-Hungarian dominance over Western Ukraine was regarded as an aberration, whereas the expansion of the Russian imperial dominance over the same territory was justified as the restoration of the previously existing unity. In this scheme, which Florovsky uncritically assumed, the cultural standards of Moscow-grown Orthodoxy tended to be read back into the unique earlier situation of the 17th century Kievan theological tradition, which in reality contained a complex interplay of Western European and Slavic elements. But Florovsky lamented the Western influences upon the Kievan school of theology as something self-evidently deplorable. He also assumes that the modes of folk piety and the styles of worship, unlike academic theology, remained untouched by the West, speaking of, I quote, tension, divorce, and opposition between piety and teaching, unquote. But this assumption is demonstrably false. The iconography, architecture, church music, and folk piety of what is now Western and Central Ukraine were heavily influenced by the Christian West in the 16th through 19th century. As a well-known example, consider the 17th, 18th century restoration of the cupola of the St. Sophia Church in Kiev in the style of Ukrainian Baroque. And of course, just thousands of examples from the Lviv region could be cited also to back up this claim. And so contrary to Florovsky, there was no rift between theology and church life, because all aspects of church life, including art and piety, were, like theology, to some extent westernized. And of course, the very fact that they were westernized in and of itself should not be treated as epistemologically problematic. Moreover, Florovsky's sharp dichotomy between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East has limited application to the Ukrainian territory that was politically contested by Poland, Austro-Hungary, and the Russian Empire. This territory had its own share of ethnic struggles and experiments in political and religious boundary drawing and redrawing. The fact that today Eastern Catholicism has the second largest number of adherents in the world, that is to say, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church counts approximately 4.5 million adherents worldwide, second only to Syro-Malabar Church in India, which estimated 3.85 million residing in Ukraine. That fact cannot be dismissed as a historical accident. Rather, the westernization of Orthodoxy and the orientalization of Catholicism went hand in hand and indeed continue in Ukraine and also adjacent areas of Poland to this day. Visit Lublin. Lublin is exhibit number 1 of, again, a Near East, if you will, meeting Near West. And I'm using Near East, of course, in this case, in application to Western Ukraine. Florovsky's rigid dichotomy between the East and the West was both anachronistic and historically unjustifiable in the case of Ukraine, especially its western part, where there was a continuing cross-pollination of the Orthodox Eastern and the Catholic and Protestant Western motifs. So despite his mother's Ukrainian roots, Florovsky was thoroughly Russified, and the result could not imagine Ukraine, whether past or future, as anything else but a culturally subordinate part of the defunct Russian Empire. This was a blind spot that he shared with other pre-revolutionary intellectuals of mixed ethnic background. A very different narrative which did justice to the cultural and political distinctiveness of the Ukrainian nation was available to him in the works of a prominent Ukrainian historical, Mikhailo Hrushevsky. Florovsky, of course, was aware of this work and also carefully studied Dmytro Chyzhevsky's work, but went along with the prevalent imperial narrative instead. In Florovsky's master narrative, Russian theology includes the contributions of all figures born in the territories that at some point in history were parts of the Russian Empire. But such an imperialist assumption of Russian cultural hegemony, consisting in the absorption of the contributions of culturally and linguistically distinct peoples, is hardly legitimate. For example, Florovsky considered Petro Mohyla, Grigory Skovoroda, and Pamfil Yurkevich as being without qualification a part of Russian theological legacy. But Mohyla was of Moldovan origin and born in Suceava, Romania. Skovoroda and Yurkevich were born in Ukraine. The first two figures wrote in Ukrainian, while Yurkevich wrote in Russian because the repressive Russian government made it illegal to publish scholarly works in Ukrainian. Skovoroda's work was celebrated by Dmytro Chyzhevsky, as I already pointed out, and others, as the first original Eastern Slavic contribution to religious philosophy. And so in his outlines, Chyzhevsky presented Yurkevich as another major figure of a distinctly Ukrainian religious philosophical tradition. Florovsky studied Chyzhevsky's work closely, but didn't engage his friend's compelling historiographic scheme in the ways of Russian theology. In this regard, it might be interesting to see or ask those who know their correspondence better whether this particular issue is ever raised, whether this really dramatic difference of interpretive frameworks ever really surfaces in their correspondence. And I do not know. Russian in the title of Florovsky's book is a misleading synecdoche that encompasses ethnic Russians as well as numerous non-Russian speakers of various Slavonic languages who contributed to the multicultural heritage of what under Catherine II would become a part of the Russian Empire and cease to exist after the Bolshevik Revolution. One problematic consequence of lumping the Kievan theological tradition together with later Muscovite tradition was the distinctiveness of Ukrainian religious and intellectual heritage, which had achieved a measure of integration of the East and West. And I think that's a second distinctive characteristic of that tradition. It's the peculiar mix of the East and West, was dismissed as an early pseudomorphosis of Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, in his review of the English edition of the Ways of Russian Theology, Frank Sisson noted, and I quote Frank, "Like many Russian historians in the 19th century, Florovsky refuses to recognize any separate, valid development of Ukrainian history, culture, and theology. Yet he condemns Ukrainians for the many characteristics, views, or sentiments that distinguish them from the Russians. He refuses to consider that there were ways of Ukrainian theology closely related to the Ukraine's development. Here, I venture to suggest that Florovsky's understanding of the needs of the present affected his evaluation of Mohyla's age. After all, The Ways of Russian Theology was written in 1937, after the Ukrainian National Revolution and the rebirth of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church had occurred. In a number of instances, Florovsky's opinions on the characteristics of Mohyla and his age and their lasting harmful influences in the Ukraine can be seen as a condemnation of Ukrainian Orthodoxy and the Ukrainian national movement. Thus, Florovsky's cultural bias, which favored Russian imperial narrative, led to a profoundly distorted presentation of the Kievan theological tradition. Let me now offer a few words in conclusion. To conclude, I've considered two narratives of Ukrainian theology and philosophy. Both narratives do not make a rigid distinction between the two disciplines and therefore provide for an illuminating comparison. Both narratives were written by contemporaries of mixed Russian-Ukrainian origin. Both Florovsky and Chyzhevsky produced their studies in emigration, which determined their context, and I would be glad to dwell on this particular point during Q&A, and also impose limitations on the accessibility of sources available only in Ukraine. Both narratives, I would argue, may be regarded as narratives of emancipation. Florovsky, who maintained that he was disinterested in political history, uncritically assumed the framework of Russian imperial narrative and imposed it on the Ukrainian authors. Whatever its colonial premises, Florovsky's narrative also had an emancipatory function. Namely, he wished to liberate Orthodox theology from its intellectual, one might say, epistemic captivity to Western theology. Now, Chyzhevsky's narrative was radically different. He produced the first historical account of philosophical thought in Ukraine without subsuming it under the umbrella of imperial history. The very fact of constructing, or better, retrieving a narrative where there was none, is an act of emancipation, as I observed at the beginning of my talk. It's an act of emancipation from an unintentional oblivion due to colonial scattering of resources and from the intentional suppression by the colonizer. Today, following Chyzhevsky, we need a new narrative of Ukrainian theological and philosophical tradition. This narrative has to live up to the highest standards of current philosophical, theological, and historical scholarship. Such a narrative needs to be truthful. It should eschew politicization and idealization at all costs. Such a narrative should be patriotic, but devoid of narrow nationalism. If these conditions are met, then such a narrative could also serve as a vehicle of spiritual resistance to the Russian state that, once again, wishes to engulf and colonize Ukraine. Those of us who are unable to bear arms in defense of Ukraine could still offer resistance peacefully. Glory to the fallen heroes, glory to Ukraine, Slava Ukraini. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you very much for your inspiring and very discursive speech. Any questions, comment? And maybe I would like to start discussion. I have two questions. One of these are closely connected with the content of the, for example, Way of the Russian Theology of Florovsky, and second one about methodological presupposition for philosophy of history, for historical narrative of our two intellectual heroes. And my first questions, you remember that Nikolai Berdyaev evaluated the way of Russian theology as a pathless, but without any way. Berdyaev and many intellectuals of the first way of the Russian immigration critical, they have a critical attitude to this book. And what is your opinion? Is this critical message of the Florovsky narrative can help us, or it will be fruitful for our understanding of the phenomenon of the Ruski Mir and imperial narratives? You know that Dugin and many other imperial thinkers today, they, how to tell more correctly, steal legacy of Florovsky, appropriated him as a really founder of their own position. What do you think about this critical message of the way of Russian theology of Florovsky as a fruitful resource for our Ukrainian historical narratives?
Well, thank you, Ina. That's a wonderful and sophisticated question. I think any thinker of Florovsky's complexity could be ideologically twisted, and certainly what's happening now for Dugin and others. And I think those fascists need to be studied very carefully, and they need to be understood, and not only that, but also exposed. And I think a lot more work needs to be done on the Russian world ideology. Of course, a lot of work has already been done, but more needs to be done More importantly, I'm still really profoundly disgusted by the fact that most of the leaders of the Orthodox Church, with the exception of Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, have not decisively spoken against the Russian world ideology that is proffered by Patriarch Kirill Gundyaev. I think that in itself requires an account. I think your main question had to do with the issue whether Florovsky somehow supplied the Russian world position to the present day ideologues on a platter. This is where I would be more cautious. And the principal point is this: generally speaking, for me, what's the cash value of Florovsky? Often it is the fact that he had these incredible insights that then took up, and they really took up almost for a generation. So this whole business of freeing Orthodoxy from its Western influences, that was an important thing to say in the 1930s, when Orthodox theology was a largely unknown commodity and when it was completely unknown and misunderstood. So this was an identity claim in many ways. And the second insight that I want to lift up, because it's really directly relevant to your question, is this: why is it that he breaks with Eurasianism in 1925? He backdated that break in his own mind and in his own work. He backdated it to 1923. In my judgment, there is actually no reason to believe that he broke up with them early. This was a fairly lengthy process, and he certainly engaged with Eurasians. He was one of the founders of the Eurasian movement. He did not believe that the main Eurasian claim that Orthodoxy is closer to Islam and Russia is closer to Asia than to everybody else, that claim held any historical water. But more importantly, the reason he broke, because for him, the orientation always had to be for specifically what he called Christian, or later would call Christian Hellenism. But the main reason why he breaks up with the Eurasian movement is that what he sees in the Eurasian movement is a very strong propulsion to weaponize and politicize the faith. And so the Eurasian claim was, we need to wait until the Marxist dogma burns itself out and proves self-destructive. That, by the way, that was more or less accurate. At least for the Soviet context, that was accurate. So we need to wait for the time when Marxism will collapse, and then there will be an ideological vacuum. And what do you then replace that vacuum with? You replace it specifically with the Orthodox Church. And then they had their own organic theory. Eurasians had or the organic theory as to why that would be a legitimate thing. And then his claim was that faith, that the Orthodox faith, could then fund an authoritarian state. And they were, again, these are 1930s, so a lot of people are flirting, 20s, but still, it's already the beginning, certainly, of flirtation with authoritarianisms in Europe. And so apparently many people found that particular position to be attractive. And Florovsky said absolutely no to that, and that is that in his mind, the sort of faith always has to trump the political, or rather, it has to remain free of the political entanglements. And so, to that extent, I think he is very anti-Russian world figure, and I think his heritage could be used in that respect. But to the extent also to which the Russian world position includes this concept of also almost an ontological difference between the Holy Russia and the rest of the godless West, to that extent, of course, there is a version of that view in Florovsky, although, of course, Florovsky would never be so reductionist or so intentionally obscurantist as to simply claim that the West is nothing but something post-Christian or pagan or whatnot. So that type of rhetoric, that type of language that we find, of course, in the ideology of the Russian world, because ideologies feed on facile dichotomies, we will, of course, never find in Florovsky. Florovsky might have not been able to discern or see mainline Protestantism. He certainly was incredibly, he had incredible respect for his Anglican colleagues and interlocutors. And of course, he quote unquote saw Catholicism. I think the broader and mainline Protestantism was not something that he engages kind of actively in his writings as a thinker. But that said, he, of course, was a major figure in the ecumenical movement, and any kind of notion that he would not fail to see the Christian pedigree of the West would be a mistake. It's just that he also thought that Orthodoxy culturally and epistemically succumbing to Western Christianity was a deep problem. And I think in his time, this was an important word to say. So I want to kind of index that historically by saying that in the 20s and 30s, that was an important statement to make. Of course, a lot of people in Russia, Serbia, and Greece are still very fond of that thesis. They're very fond of this thesis that Orthodox theology secures its purity by simply being de-Westernized. But I think my generation of thinkers, theologians, philosophers, sociologists, etc., certainly look at that dynamic in a very different manner and do not quite want to simply say that somehow it's even historically or culturally plausible to sort of enact that purification. And perhaps more importantly, I want to draw on Florovsky's also appeal to the universality of Orthodoxy. And if the Orthodox faith is something universal, then it would stand to reason that it would embrace in some profound ways everything that is true and good and beautiful about the Christian West. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will think about. Paul Valier, thank you. Please, your phone.
Paul, thank you very much for the presentation. It's so rich and there's so much to think about. Here's my question, and it's a real question because I don't know Chyzhevsky well enough to answer it. What were his theological commitments? And is he at all explicit about his theological commitments in his history of Ukrainian philosophy?
I think that's a great question. It's a really wonderful question, Paul. My sense is that he approaches this material primarily as an intellectual historian. And I have to say, Paul, that this is a case where I myself am out of my depth, because, I mean, Chyzhevsky is a relatively new material for me. It really is. And by the way, when I'm presenting, this is really kind of fresh off the press. I really finished this particular paper last night, and because I was dissatisfied with the place that Chyzhevsky fails to play, was a lacuna in my own Florovsky book. And specifically, I thought that, because I do some work, as you know, 2 chapters that are dedicated to the ways of Russian theology. I do some work on Spet, for example, and Spet's historiography, but I do not, well, very little on Chyzhevsky. I mean, so I would actually defer to Ina to answer the question of Chyzhevsky's own theological convictions, because they're not very obvious to me in the letters, but I'm sure there is a discussion of that. What do we know? What do we know about Chyzhevsky's own theological views?
My conclusion based on the investigation of Irina Valyavka, one of the best specialists in Chyzhevsky heritage. She's working in the Institute of Philosophy, and just now she is very active in all conferences and events closely connected with the anniversary of Chyzhevsky. Her point of view about some deep religious belief of Chyzhevsky, but as a scholar, he didn't open his personal belief on the page of his books. But at the same time, you know that, for example, his description of the Skovoroda legacy based on the understanding of the close connection with Skovoroda views with the German mystical tradition. And I suppose all intellectual biography of Chyzhevsky opens for us his mystical root, personal and interest as a scholar. As you know, he found very, very interesting sources. Jan Amos Kamensky, Pan Sophia, mystical treatise of Jan Amos Kamensky, Pan Sophia, but I suppose it's not occasionally. It's my point of view as a first step to the understanding of the these very, very difficult and deep questions. And can we find, for example, my second questions that I don't ask you, Pavel, maybe later, what about such theoretical presupposition? Is Chyzhevsky used this theological types of explanation of the historical events or not? It's a question.
Yes, no, I don't. It's interesting. Yes. So does he have some sort of an account, for example, of Providence acting through Ukrainian intellectual history? I don't find. I think he very often operates at a fairly granular level. In other words, he is interested in treating a specific figure and then also making connections. And I think the word narracy, which I've rendered as outlines, kind of sketches, if you will, narracy is a good word for what he is doing in the Narcis's Истории философии на Украине. I think it's a really good word, a really good descriptor of what he's doing. His main framework seems to be there are these two approaches to philosophy, one universalizing every philosophical claim, the other one seeing it as precisely somehow reflective of a local culture and even quote-unquote national character. Obviously, in the 21st century, we'll look at the concepts of national character with far, greater methodological sophistication and much more critically, and especially kind of in the situation of multiculturalism that we so often find ourselves, kind of including, of course, the, let's say, present-day Odessa or present-day Kyiv or any of these centers, coloring them East and West, that in itself might actually be something that needs to be refined and challenged. But at least what needs to happen, I think, methodologically, is to look at Western Ukraine as a unique mix and a unique conjunction of Eastern and Western Christian motifs, where, as I said, Catholicism becomes Easternized, certainly liturgically, right? And then Orthodoxy is also Westernized in a variety of ways, from artistic to forms of thought, assumptions, cultural assumptions, to maybe something more profound in terms of theology. But how Eastern Catholicism itself actually articulates its own distinctiveness vis-a-vis Latin Rite Catholicism is in and of itself an interesting kind of internal discussion that could be had. So in that regard, Paul, to kind of return also to your question quickly, the comparison to some extent breaks down because Florovsky is very open about his theological views. He's also very open, and he's fun and interesting to read because he is so direct about his normative assumptions. I mean, there's actually more of Florovsky's normative assumptions on every page than there is what I would regard history. But then I also marshaled, and I really wanted to test this out because I myself very much doubt. I mean, I certainly would not want to say that somehow the main goal of historical analysis of emancipation, that would be, for me, that would be just to tilt the scale too far. But I guess what I was trying to do in the beginning is I was trying to say that to the extent to which historians' art is retrieval of something from oblivion, and in the case of Ukrainian theology and philosophy, we're clearly dealing with a situation where the narrative itself is sort of lacking, the critical mass of exponents, the critical mass of people that would be talking about it. Certainly in much of the Western Academy. In other words, the discussion, and I think lots of us here on this call would confirm this, the discussion of Russian religious thought, that's a full bookcase, if you will, at Oxford's Blackwells. Okay, the discussion of Ukrainian thought is one shelf, and I would like, in many ways, that particular, and I think a significant, an important reason for that is Ukraine's colonial past and the kind of scattering that many of us, me included, in effect, have assumed or have ignored as we look at the evidence. So I certainly think that Chyzhevsky invites us to look at the evidence differently. I also would like to say to everybody, to all colleagues, that whenever we look at historiography that is almost 100 years old, we have to be both critical but also gentle in the sense of not bringing, frankly, all of the machinery and all of the obvious achievements of contemporary historiography or philosophy of history to kind of bear on those sources, because otherwise it would be kind of creative destruction, right? So I'm certainly not, I'm cheerleadering for Chyzhevsky today. But boy, he would probably not pass. If this was a dissertation, he would have been submitted to yours truly. There would have been a lot of work to be done before that would have, it would have been a brilliant piece, okay? A brilliant piece, but it would have had to be, in many ways, it would have had to be rewritten, reworked, etc. In terms of, well, for example, the whole thing lacks conclusion. Okay, there's no conclusion. And you would want, after that wonderful methodological beginning, you would want some kind of conclusion. So they were clearly also laboring, I think, in difficult circumstances of emigration, and those circumstances, I think, matter. Florovsky is a different story. Was that magnum opus, which, by the way, Kartashov asked him whether he could submit the Ways of Russian Theology as a doctoral thesis for Saint-Serge. And at that point, he was already so alienated from St. Sergius Institute in Paris that Florovsky said, "Niet." He said, "No, not interested." But that at least to some extent that corrects the narrative that everybody in immigration just went cannibalistic on the Ways of Russian Theology and disliked it, because there were particularly, we just published, Iota Publications just brought out Mirolod Borodin. So Mirolod Borodin, I guess, was this rare, and Losky. So Vladimir Losky and Mirolod Borodin were the people that certainly took what Florovsky had to do, what had to say in the Ways of Russian Theology quite seriously. But you're also right, of course, that after Berdyayev's absolutely devastating critique, the word besputia, the waywardness or pathlessness, the word besputia sticks in your memory in such a way, just rhetorically, that it's very difficult to get it out once you read that. Once you read that, but I also would say, and I think, and this was my kind of methodological prelude to the Florovsky work, at least to the extent to which I understand the way in which these accounts of each other's work were done in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s by the kind of Renaissance figures. And in many ways, the kind of the polemical rhetoric was expected from these reviews, whereas we kind of expect the rhetoric of praise. In the Anglo-American world, it's kind of 90% praise. Then, you look for the meat towards the end, usually. You look for suggestions for improvement really towards the very, very end of the book review. And I think we've ritualized two very, very different approaches for how reviews are done. And so Berdyayev's critique of Florovsky, in my judgment, is a sign of his profound intellectual respect for him. And Florovsky, I think, misread that. Because, of course, Florovsky broke up was the editorship of Put, of journal Put, that he was co-editing with Berdyaev after 1937. He was no longer a part of it, and I suspect that one of the reasons was Berdyaev's absolutely devastating review. But I think it was a review of somebody, of a giant, of an intellectual giant who certainly respected Florovsky. But if you look at Berdyaev's reviews of Bulgakov, you will find similarly highly polemical.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the link to this lecture and for your highly interesting lecture. I would like to ask about your conclusion. You have said that there is urgent need to have an intellectual history of Ukrainian theological thought. And I would like to ask whether there are real plans for this, or would you like, for example, to undertake this work yourself, or other any project, or there is just a good wish at this stage?
So that's a terrific question, Olena. Really, really terrific question. So as many of you know, of course, Tim Snyder and a number of other colleagues are running now this massive project on broadly conceived Ukrainian history, full stop. From Tripilia culture to I think Tim puts it as from the Vikings to the present. And it's a project that involves over 100 historians, if I'm not mistaken. And that's a project that has been now, I think it was announced close to about a year ago. And I could certainly send the references to the project. Now, within that, would there be a recognizable space or place for Ukrainian theological tradition or philosophical tradition? That remains to be seen. I would say that Natalia Sienkiewicz, who is in Germany, I'm blanking now on her institutional affiliation, but Natalia Sienkiewicz would be in the best position to be someone who would oversee the project specifically of Ukrainian theological tradition. Okay. And so, or another possibility and a somewhat broader project would be a rewriting of the history of Christianity in Ukraine, because we have one or two significant examples of that in the post-Soviet Ukraine, and then we have really bad Soviet historiography of that period. So the history of Christianity of Ukraine in all periods is a broader project. What interests me is a subset within that, namely its Ukrainian religious intellectual history, again, including theology and philosophy. And I am myself at this juncture, because I run 2 NGOs and my life is insane, I am interested specifically in meta-narratives. I'm particularly interested in in what grand narrative would emerge. And so, Elena, the answer is yes, we're working on that. We're meeting in Vienna, Austria at the European Academy of Religion. Natalia this is Natalia Sienkiewicz specifically. So she just sent me a memo about that particular section. My understanding is also that Lydia Lozova. I don't know if you know her or not. Again, both of them are young and wonderful and vibrant. So Lydia, I think, is planning something on the more contemporary side of things. But I would say that there's tremendous work to be done specifically in this area. And let me just simply read what I have to say about the kind of plan for the future of how that could be accomplished. So just state very, very succinctly state 4 points. So first, Kievan theological tradition holds a potential for understanding the Christian West better and for moving beyond familiar polemical stereotypes. More specifically, Ukrainian theological tradition doesn't need to purify itself of its Western influences in order to be authentically Orthodox, because Orthodoxy is a universal faith, not an Oriental archaism. The critical engagement of the Christian West should be viewed as a strength rather than a compromise made by Ukrainian theologians. The engagement of which I speak is primarily theological and cultural rather than political, although, of course, presently the political dimension of this engagement has to be taken into consideration. Second, Ukrainian theological tradition doesn't have to become an antithesis to everything that comes out of Russia theologically. I understand that for the present historical moment, a posture of confrontation is likely to remain a strong temptation to many of us, and I would include myself. And we can find, of course, very serious justification in the realities of the present war for confrontation. Nevertheless, with Chyzhevsky, I believe that gathering our tradition by subtracting everything that was produced by Ukrainians in Russian or other languages would be a mistake. And so I propose to gather the Ukrainian theological tradition by addition instead of subtraction. And I think Snyder in particular certainly concurs with that broader vision, shall we say. I propose to gather the Ukrainian theological tradition by adding. And so what that means is that Kyiv-born Nikolai Berdyaev and Lev Shestov have to be considered as a part of that tradition. Certainly Kyiv-educated Vasily Zenkovsky should be treated as significant contributors to the richness of the tradition. Third, the future of Ukrainian theological tradition is impossible without a sustained reflection on its past, and Florovsky's seminal study presents a one-sided picture. We need a new historical narrative of that tradition, which would engage and supersede the narrative of the Western pseudomorphosis. Such a historical narrative could take as its starting point the historical studies of Kyiv Theological Academy, that the historical studies that Kyiv Theological Academy has undertaken in the 19th century, specifically such scholars as Viktor Oskachensky, Stepan Golubev, Nikolai Petrov, and others. So the scholars based in Ukraine are in the best position to undertake a massive task of such a historical revision. And then finally, we need today a gathering of intellectual, spiritual, administrative, and financial resources to build up Ukrainian theological tradition of the future. Many of us recognize that the Maidan was important not only morally and politically, but also theologically. And so theology of the Revolution of Dignity is an important contemporary chapter of the Ukrainian theological tradition. And I would add to these also two other chapters, and that's the theology of Holodomor, which we don't really have, and also a theology of just war and just peace. And I think that those two elements kind of need to be, those two bookends also need to be as a part of the picture in the 20th century. So I think there has to be somebody who would handle the 20th century. But I would, Olena, I would recommend that you get in touch with Natalia Sienkiewicz and anybody else on this call who is actually interested in the project of looking at and reconstructing Ukrainian theological tradition, adding to that philosophy too, obviously, is certainly welcome to simply shoot me a memo, and then I will connect you also with Natalia. But Natalia would be really the key person, the sort of the principal investigator, shall we say, on this. She's young and energetic, and that's always great.
Thank you. Any questions, comment, opposition?
I have a question.
Olena, please, Olena, and after that, Sergei Shevtsov. Olena, Alava.
Thank you. My questions is, can we in general call Russian theology? Because I have big doubts if we can call Russian history. I mean history as a scientific discipline. So because in my view it's a kind of propaganda. So can we call Russian theology? Maybe it's also a kind of propaganda because it's politically oriented too very much.
Yes, first of all, I certainly agree with you. I also, and those who are a bit more familiar with my writings would know this. You know, I started with this notion that could history be an exercise in emancipation? Let me just say that I don't actually typically work in this mode, as probably as lots of you know. But it's not an uninteresting question to ponder. It's an important issue in terms of especially post-colonial theories and also feminist theories. And I think that not all of them are purely reducible to ideological elements, because there's clearly significant factual base for the claims that are being made. That said, I myself, of course, would be the person who would say that whenever we're trying to convert a historical narrative into a weapon of ideology, we need to exercise enormous amount of caution. So, Olena, Yelena, I'm really with you there entirely. Now, is the present theory of the Russian world, of Ruski Mir, is that theory, could it be called theology? Broadly speaking, I think that term could be applied, but at the same time, it's absolutely true that it's primarily a geopolitical quasi-doctrine. It's a geopolitical quasi-theory that has been weaponized to serve the war, and therefore, of course, it is very strongly ideological. So there are some people who also call it a heresy, and I have no problem using that language. It's a language that's useful in some contexts. It's a language that is of lesser interest when you're dealing with something like International Criminal Court. So it depends. And by the way, Patriarch Kirill should be sued with Putin and others by the International Criminal Court, because I can tell you, speaking for my own church worldwide, I know that it will take it another 1,000 years to get any kind of canonical ruling against Patriarch Kirill. So we can't wait that long, because we don't expect him to live that long. And frankly, post-mortem condemnation might be useful, but in this case, I think the action needs to be happening more swiftly. So can it be called, to return to the question, can it be called theology? I think when the historical dust settles, or when the journalistic dust settles, the only thing for which 21st century or the late part 20th century, early part 21st century Russian Orthodoxy will be remembered would be the Russian world doctrine. Because it's not, it cannot be dismissed easily. It's a serious business in terms of its impact. Not in terms of its truth claims. Its truth claims, all of them are bogus, and so it's bogus. In my judgment, of course, it is quasi theology. It's a distortion. It's a profound distortion of what theology is. But bad theology is still theology. Bad theology. So my preferred metaphor for the Russian world is actually neither ideology nor a heresy. It's much closer to false prophecy, because of course it deals with apocalyptic themes. It taps into this whole business of katekon, of this figure of 2 Thessalonians, of the person who is preventing the end of the world, and in this case, it's the Russian leader that's playing that particular role. And so it taps into the apocalyptic imagery, and to invoke what? To invoke our kind of worst passions, to our passions specifically towards dominance and towards violence. And at the extent to which it provokes or taps into the worst passions, in my judgment, it's a form of religious or theological pornography. So it's pornography because it's so widespread, because it's a form of public theology, okay? And it's pornography because it takes something that is meant to be important, namely discourse about God and intimate, and it twists it, and it channels it in a completely wrong direction. And it also, I would say, it moves the emotions, and it moves the will to greater extent that it's, for example, moves the mind. Because there aren't that many credible people who would say the Russian world doctrine is cogent, or that it makes sense geopolitically or otherwise, or certainly that it makes sense theologically. That the claim that there is this triune nation of Russians, Ukrainians, and people of Belarus, nobody claims that particular exclusivist, very strange claim is particularly meaningful. But it's certainly, there's no question that it's influential. And to the extent to which that's the case, one could look at it, again, through the lens, as I said, through the lens of ideology, through the lens of heresy, through the lens of false prophecy. pseudo, I guess, pseudo history also. And as I mentioned last, my metaphor would be it's a form of religious pornography.
Thank you for your answer and for your interesting talk. Thank you.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, Sergey Shevtsov. Please, Professor Sergey Shevtsov.
Okay, thank you for very interesting presentation. And I would like to ask you, it's very interesting to compare two different thinkers as Florovsky and Chyzhevsky, but the problem for me is different approach them to the tradition. Chyzhevsky have read a positive approach to the tradition 18th and 19th centuries, and Florovsky have critical position to the positive to the Byzantium tradition and negative or critical to the tradition of 18th, 19th century. And what you think, in your opinion, is it this difference has root in their worldview, worldviews, or it's methodological difference that constructed on the different methodological position of Chyzhevsky and Florovsky? What do you think?
Professor Shevtsov, it's a really great question. I think it also helps to clarify something in Florovsky himself, and it's something that, at least in my Florovsky monograph, I did not bring out sufficiently because I wanted to run with his own meta-narrative of pseudomorphosis, and I of course gave you a quotation. So you're absolutely right. As far as his analysis of the 18th century is concerned, he is consistently negative, meaning he is claiming that there is a kind of a Protestant pseudomorphosis that's happening from Peter the Great and following that sort of trajectory. But with the 19th century, he is much more nuanced. And you actually would not find him simply engaging in a kind of a facile dismissal of everything that's happening in the 19th century. And there are lots of reasons for that, lots of reasons also in his own, because he really had a love and hate relationship with Romanticism in all of its forms. And so on the one hand, he condemns German idealism, and everything that's German idealism is smacking of monism and smacking of Origenism and Platon, and bad forms of Platonism. Okay, and so for that reason, it's bad. But then historiographically, also he actually takes on some of the ideas of specifically the Romantic movement, especially this notion of a form of empathy vis-a-vis the historical text, the extent to which we need to there has to develop some kind of fellow feeling, if you will, for the historical figures that we are discussing. And there are other examples of that. So was the 19th century, as far as he was concerned, was far too complex. And of course, he also lifts up the figure of specifically of Filaret of Moscow, Drozdov, and that's the 19th century Moscow metropolitan, who for him represented a kind of a forerunner, a pioneering figure in the neo-patristic Renaissance, in the neo-patristic revival. And there were reasons why Florovsky held him in very high regard. So with the night, and of course also you have to understand that in Florovsky's evolution, engaging Vladimir Solovyov as his guide to Christ, that's what he calls it. And then by 1924, being disenchanted with Solovyov's Sophiology. That was another significant element that underlies his discussion of 19th century. So if you read his discussion of the 19th century carefully, the pseudomorphosis material for some reason is just not there. Most of the time, that scheme fails, or he simply abandons it and he's no longer interested in it because it's too constraining when it comes to the discussion of his sources. He could still claim for sociology that the whole thing is just a German idealist pseudomorph. And in fact, he goes to say something of that kind. But I think he probably, he respected Bulgakov too much to simply just make that sort of a blanket statement. Does that help? Does that help? So his very nuanced and complex treatment of what's happening in the 19th century, because so much, of course, about the understanding of contemporary theology, whatever theology you're thinking about, mainline Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox, is about how you understand the 19th century. So much is and so for that reason, and I'm glad, actually, in a sense, I'm actually glad that Florovsky breaks out of his own scheme. That said, I think that Chyzhevsky is very consistently neutral, and Florovsky rejects the notion that there could be neutrality. And of course, that in itself, look, that's a fun conversation for some other seminar, right? That's such a complex topic, and generally speaking, I think it's much safer epistemologically to take a position that judgments in history are inevitable, therefore neutrality might be an unachievable, and it's a question whether it's an ideal or not, but it's certainly not achievable, practically. Does that help?
Okay, thank you. In my opinion, Florovsky has ambivalent relation to the 19th century tradition. He has a good relation to the looking for roots of Byzantium roots of modern thought, but in the same time he has skeptical to the different extremal lines like Slavonophiles, or for example some looking for modern at that time writers. If Chyzhevsky can speak about philosophy of Gogol, for example, Florovsky, for them, it's very strange to speak about Gogol philosophy. It's very, for him, it's to our imagination of philosophy, not real philosophy for him. And this difference seems me very important for to compare these two authors. Okay, but in any case, thank you very much.
I think it could be fruitfully debated whether Mykola Gogol should pass for a philosopher. There is no question. I would certainly regard him as a theologian. We have from him one of the deepest, for example, his discussion of the divine liturgy, and he certainly was. His faith itself was very, very deep, and I also think that it would be very interesting to read what I at school read in an utterly and completely secularized and kind of Sovietized version, because I went to school in Kiev. It would be very interesting to read all of these texts, Revizor or Mертвые души. It would be really fascinating, or Вечера на хуторе близ Диканьки. All of that stuff would be fascinating to read theologically. And so I share with Chyzhevsky the notion that, it'd be fun, it'd be, I think, very interesting to read even somebody like Taras Shevchenko, whatever you make of his anthropocentrism, okay? It'd be interesting to read him as a liberation theologian. An anachronistic description, in this case, anachronistic description is deliberate because I simply want to provoke a thought. that's not an unreasonable characterization, given his interest in social justice questions, etc. And that doesn't have to happen simply along the Marxian lines. It could certainly happen within Christian lines themselves. I'm just simply suggesting that a lot of these sources could be read differently if we do not dismiss them offhand. That said, I'm not saying, of course, that means that everybody should pass for a theologian. And also, something happens when you translate that term into Slavic languages. So suddenly theologians become these wonderful figures with halos on the walls. And at least in the West, we just don't treat them in that manner, okay? So, you know, I'm in the theology department, so all of my colleagues are, in fact, theologians, okay? That's what's in their title. Now, you could then make, of course, differentiations between significance of various figures, for sure. But I think it's very interesting to read poets and writers as offering something of theological import. You know, whether Hohol could be regarded a philosopher depends what. Okay, he's certainly not an Anglo-American philosopher in the sense of in which analytic tradition takes that term. But why should we be constrained by the analytic tradition? You know, I mean, we don't. That constraint itself is cultural, and to some extent at least, is arbitrary. So at this point, my suggestion is that we deal with the Ukrainian philosophical and theological tradition that it's still a subject that requires a considerable amount of unearthing and considerable amount of retrieval. So I would say that because the baby is relatively small right now, that we treat it gently, okay? We treat it gently. Then, when it becomes a body of knowledge, we can go haywire criticizing, you know, whatever a particular position would be. And I think that there's certainly plenty. There would be within that. There would be also plenty of space for legitimate critique of both Chyzhevsky and Florovsky, but certainly Chyzhevsky.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you will.
Thank you. Any questions, comments, discussions? And let me please, yeah. Thank you, Professor Mansing.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk and for the discussion. I have a little remark, actually. You mentioned the analytic tradition within philosophy. And actually, it's not exactly an Anglo-American tradition, because it also has its roots in Lviv, a city that is now part of Ukraine. So there's the Lviv Warsaw School. So it would be, I think, also very interesting to look at analytic philosophy in Ukraine, if there's something in the 20th century or not. Thank you.
Well, I first of all, I had no clue that it had roots in Lviv. That'd be interesting to look at some sources. I myself have nothing but profound respect for the general tradition. We actually, IOTA Publications also published natural theology in the Eastern Orthodox tradition as, you know, as one of its volumes more recently. So, and that was co-edited by Richard Swinburne, who is a kind of a Thomas Aquinas of the 20th century analytic philosophy of religion, and a convert to Orthodoxy, and David Bradshaw, and a wonderful a team of philosophers and theologians. But it would be really interesting to look at what Lviv had to offer. What century are you thinking about? What give us some clues as to the authors, perhaps, and period.
I think it started in 1894 with Twardowski.
Oh.
And then there are all these famous names, Tarski, and I mean, Tarski is maybe more in Warsaw, but you know, who else? Łukasiewicz, Kotabinsky, all these. I mean, okay, at that time, Lviv was still in the was still part of Austria. Maybe yes. So it changed its the countries to which it belonged several times. But since nowadays it's in Ukraine, maybe it's interesting.
you know, the names you cite, thank you. The names you cite also suggest to me that after a while, there needs to be a reasonable distribution of labor, and we might very well still keep two narratives distinct. And that is the narrative about theological tradition and the narrative about the kind of philosophical thought proper. And because obviously while there is an overlap, I hope I didn't produce a false impression that I somehow treat the two elements somehow as as somehow something that you as interchangeable. I certainly don't treat them as interchangeable. I myself sort of have a stake in both, so I share that with Florovsky and with Chyzhevsky. I sort of have a stake in both. But that said, I think there certainly could be a space, should be a legitimate space for primarily an account of Ukrainian, of philosophy in Ukraine. And notice, by the way, if you say Ukrainian philosophical tradition, then to some extent you are setting for yourself a task of defending that there is something amounting to a continuous tradition. If you say a history of philosophy in Ukraine, that gives you an important geographic marker, but you might be, methodologically at least, you might be freer to some extent, right? So, and that in itself is an interesting question to discuss, because of course, you know, the term tradition, both in common expression and certainly theologically, is a very, very weighty term and with a very long history. And so that in and of itself might either generate a useful conversation on whether there is such a thing in Ukraine, or a wild goose chase if we load it up with too many normative assumptions.
Thank you. Thank you. Questions, comments, remarks? Thank you so much. We are talking near 2 hours now, and I am so happy that our first meeting and first speech is so active, is so discussive, it's so intensive and fruitful for our future investigation and future thinking. And maybe at my last point, notes about methodological impact of your two heroes. For example, I radically disagree that George Florovsky is not very good philosopher, especially in his early years. His articles and paper about logical relativism, or his brilliant article is closely connected with our discussion on historical interpretation о историческом истолковании, published in Prague, today is very important because he proposed the very, very fruitful way of the humaneutical investigation of the historical process. And at the same time, Chyzhevsky, he was the member of the research group Poetic and Humaneutic in Germany, together with Hans Blumenberg and other founder of this very, very fruitful movement. And my last sentence, proposition to look on the legacy of these two very contradictory thinkers from this point of view of their methodological resource and methodological ideas that are very fruitful for our future understanding of the historical narratives. So it's my points on your brilliant speech today, dear Pavel.
Yeah, this is very helpful. No, this is very helpful. And I agree that I just skimmed the surface of things that could be said about their major methodological moves and sort of went in that direction of emancipation because it felt like an interesting angle to pursue. But that was really in the nature of improvisation, really, today. And I agree that there's just a lot. So what you're saying is that what needs to be done, in addition to whatever it is that I've done here, is Florovsky the philosopher, compared to Chyzhevsky, where he functions not purely, let's say, as a historian of philosophy, but offers either reflections on the philosophy of history that are methodological, or Chyzhevsky the philosopher. I mean, so that's the kind of work that you think should be done. I agree. I
He
can agree.
originated from the Husserl school, and
Yes.
all his life, it was very occasionally that he became more philologist and Slavic scholars, because his dream was to continue his phenomenological research. Maybe it's not so. It's a testimony from his from the material to his biography, Chyzhevsky biography, that was edited by Irina Valyavka, Vladimir Jansen, German scholar. It's really his dream to continue phenomenological the way of thinking. And is it maybe is he continue his phenomenological methodology in his Slavic or historical works? It's a question. But at the same time, we need to reconstruct these methodological and deep philosophical roots.
You know, I was looking for Chyzhevsky, the phenomenologist, in the Naris's Истории философии на Украине, and I couldn't find him. Maybe his interest in the philosophy of the heart is, at least the interest itself indicates precisely phenomenological pedigree, but that's a maybe. Frankly, that's a hypothesis. It's not.
It's such name. It's alternative history of philosophy or history of intellectual history. It can be. It may be. It's possible.
Yeah.
When thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, of our participants. Thank you, and brilliant discussion today. Thank you very much.
So thank you, colleagues. Thank you, colleagues, for your patience and for the really great discussion. Thank you, Ina, for your just wonderful organization of these seminars. I hope the seminars continue. And also, of course, just shoot me a memo if you'd be interested in this whole sort of reconstruction of the history of philosophy in Ukraine and reconstruction of the history of theology in Ukraine, because I will not be essentially, as I mentioned, I will not be coordinating this project, but I could certainly put you in touch with people who are very serious about doing this in the future. Yeah.
Thank you very much. You will follow and come back to our discussion on our YouTube channel. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Nadia. It will be possible only with your brilliant assistance. Thank you so much. All of
Wonderful. I hope you also join us at the IOTA mega conferences, because we love to have philosophers. We have two groups dedicated to philosophy of religion and philosophical theology. And, we can guarantee that there will be a lot of interlocutors for you that would be. We have also Slavic Orthodoxy group as a part of that. And the next meeting is in January 2027. And I realize that might feel distant, but that's how we plan. And that's, God willing, is going to be in the Republic of Georgia, in Poti, of all places. So, but that's in 2027. And more immediately, we're planning a conference on the Council of Nicaea in Rome, and that's in 2025. That might be of somewhat less of an interest to you, but that's on Catholic Orthodox dialogue specifically. So yeah, again, everybody's welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice.
Thank you, organization. Thank you, Ina.
Thank you very much, Ina. Thank you very much to our speaker today.
Thank you. You are invited to the next meeting. I don't know who will be our new speaker, but I suppose it will be intriguing and fruitful and inspired. Thanks a lot. Bye.